This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay. All right. Matt, thanks for the introduction, and thank you all so much for being here. Like, seriously, I'm really excited to share this retrospective of my PhD, and I'm really excited I can do this in person, because last time I did a talk like this, it was 2020, it was the pandemic, and just like everyone in the department, I was working remotely. And 2020 was a crazy time, but being someone studying food systems between 2020 and now has been so interesting, right? 2020, or the pandemic in general, brought so many things about our food systems that we study directly into our community. Like, do you remember this? I mean, it was like mid-March 2020. I went into Aldi and it looked like this, and I was pretty shocked, right? And this was the pandemic showing us that globalized systems or globalized food systems can be quite vulnerable to things like pandemics or geopolitical issues. All right, at the same time, our food system was being constrained by natural climate disaster. You might remember that California had some pretty big fires. This was their biggest fire year by a factor of 2, okay? That was 2020. In addition, China had historic flooding, and this affected 23% of their agricultural land. It's a ton of productivity, all right? And while all of this was happening, I think the average consumer was realizing that people who work in our food systems are super essential to putting food on our tables, yet they're grossly underappreciated, okay? And today we can go to the supermarket and the shelves are pretty full, and pandemic is under control, but none of these issues are resolved, right? Let's just think about climate change. It's kind of ironic that the same areas in California that had historic fire are going historic flooding right now, okay? And on the other side of the world in China, the same places that had flooding had the hottest summer on record in 2022, and the rivers that overflooded ran dry. And so what this shows us is that climate change isn't just more extreme weather, right? It's extreme variability. And that's so problematic for farming, right? Farmers require the ability to be able to predict climates and weathers. And so the farms of the future, they need to be resilient to climate change, okay? But they also should do their part in trying to minimize environmental damage. And this is because agriculture accounts for 40% of the world's land area. That's a ton of space. And so considering how much land area is consumed by agriculture, it should be problematic to us that, things like 64% of agricultural land run the risk of pesticide pollution. We know that this pesticide pollution can be harmful to both human health and biodiversity, okay? Now, pesticides are a really broad class of chemicals. They're, as their name implies, literally anything that'll deal with a pest. So when we break down pesticides by their usage class, you'll note that both historically, as well as today, the main type of pesticide are herbicides. And hopefully this shows that a good way to make agriculture less degrading to the environment would be working towards helping farmers be less resilient on herbicides, okay? And working on more sustainable weed management. Now, another really standard weed management practice is tillage. And just like pesticides, there's nothing inherently wrong with tillage, but reliance on tillage can create systems that degrade soil health and cause erosion. And this isn't like some barely statistically significant change in soil. This can mean some pretty major losses in soil fertility and changes to regional economies. Now, in dry areas, tillage exposes soil to loss from wind-based erosion. And wet areas are at particular risk of erosion from washout due to extreme precipitation. And here in the Northeast, we're at high risk of this extreme precipitation. Compared to all of the regions in the US, we are the region that has seen the fastest increase in extreme rain events. And looking forward to the end of the century, regardless of whether or not we have a low or high carbon emission scenario, we will continue to be one of the regions in the US that sees these extreme rain events. Okay, so what does this mean, right? The farms of the future need to be resilient to climate change, and they need to minimize environmental damage. This was the context in which I did my PhD. Okay, and to address this challenge, I sought to ask, can we use ecological practices to redesign agricultural systems? And my hope is that through an understanding of internal ecological processes on farmland, we can help make farmers less reliant on external inputs, things like tillage or herbicides. Okay? So I sought to answer this question in 4 field-based experiments. The first looks at organic no-till. It's trying to optimize the productivity and weed suppression of no-till soybeans. The second system works with a relatively new perennial grain called kernza. And again, it's trying to optimize this system. Now, chapters 3 and 4 are slightly different in that instead of trying to optimize an alternative crop management system, they're focused on how we can use agricultural processes to shape weed communities. So chapter 3 is looking at how weed communities, how their traits can respond to ecological practices. And chapter 4 is looking at how specifically cover crops can modify the phylogenetic distance within weed communities. Okay, these are all different field experiments. They're all unique, but they're all tied together by this common question, which is, can we use agricultural practices to redesign agriculture? So let's see in organic no-till systems. So I accomplish organic no-till by using a cereal rye cover crop, rolling it down to create a mulch, and then directly no-till planting soybeans. And there's 2 ecological processes that I'm interested in here. The first is nitrogen tie-up from the decomposition of the cereal rye mulch. And this occurs because cereal rye is a plant that has a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio. Like its stems are literally papery. Okay, so as these mulches are being decomposed, the microbes that are consuming them need to supplement their carbon-rich diets with nitrogen from the soil. And this creates relatively low nitrogen availability in soils. And this can be problematic for weeds, which require nutrients to grow quickly and aggressively. But it might not be as problematic for a legume cash crop like soybeans, right? Legumes have this mutualistic relationship with bacteria that allow them to fix nitrogen from the air. Okay, and so theoretically, they should be less dependent on soil nitrogen availability than many weeds. Okay, now the second ecological process that I was interested in was the fact that soybeans are a plant which has a relatively high tolerance to being planted at really high rates. Why does this matter? Well, we know that high cropping densities tend to be more competitive to weeds because they'll compete better for light and space, right? They're really thick stands. And so in a system where you're not using herbicides or tillage, optimizing this competition can be important. And so my idea here is that we can leverage cereal rye mulching and really high seeding rates to have optimal organic no-till systems. Now, I tested this question in an experiment where I had this uniform rate of cereal rye rolled into a mulch, and then I first no-till planted 5 rates of soybeans. I had a gradient of no soybean control all the way up to 741,000 seeds per hectare. So I've got this tremendous range in crop density. Okay, into each of these treatments, I applied 3 rates of nitrogen fertility. I had a no nitrogen control that was really trying to look at the effects of low nitrogen environment in the cereal rye mulch. And then I had basically intermediate and very high nitrogen treatment, okay? Like all of the experiments that I'm going to discuss today, my experimental designs use basically randomized complete block design. In this case, I replicated all of my experiments or all of my treatments in 4 blocks, and then did my entire experiment at 2 sites. So I had a total of 120 plots to work with, and in each of these plots, I sampled soybean density, weed biomass, and crop yields. From these yields, I got at profits. So let's get into the first results, which is how did my treatments affect weed suppression? Well, you'll notice that all of these lines are falling from left to right. And the x-axis is soybean density. So we know that increasing crop densities is a tool of weed suppression in organic no-till. You'll also notice that there's 3 lines here. These are my 3 nitrogen treatments. And as expected, the no nitrogen control had the least amount of weed biomass. So again, this shows that using low nitrogen environments and high crop seeding rates can be used as effective tools of weed suppression in organic no-till. Now let's look at yields, okay? Notice that there's only 1 line here. What that indicates is that there is no statistically significant effect of fertilizing with nitrogen on soybean yields, okay? And so as predicted, my soybean cash crops were able to tolerate relatively low nitrogen environments. And that's important because it shows that, at least in this study, there is no trade-off between weed suppression from a low nitrogen environment and crop yields, okay, at least with soybeans. You'll notice that my yields plateaued. This was at 48 bushels per acre, which was to the T the New York State average during the year we did this experiment, okay? So organic no-till systems can be productive. What did this mean for profits? Well, the plateau in yields meant that profits had a hyperbolic shape, and they were optimized around 527,000 seeds per hectare. And that's a relatively high rate. And so this work, you know, one, it provides a guideline for farmers of how to, you know, have proper seeding rates, and it justifies the use of cereal rye mulches for weed suppression. So it applies some important applied findings for farmers, but also to me, it was a really important proof of concept that thinking and applying ecological principles to agricultural systems can be both productive and profitable, okay? And so let me remind you of the scenarios in which this occurred. Remember, we had the least amount of weed biomass when we both, there we go, when we both combined a high soybean seeding rate as well as a low nitrogen environment. All right, and that actually underscores one of the core principles of using ecology to redesign agricultural systems. And this is called the many little hammers approach for ecological weed management. The idea here is that if you're going to have an effective system without using a really strong practice like herbicides or tillage, you as a farmer or researcher should really think about combining many tactics of weed management, which might be weakly effective in isolation, but together can create a system that is overall effective. And that's exactly what we saw in my first chapter, okay? Another important principle of this approach is that by using many practices of weed management, we can spread the burden of control, okay? And so if any one tactic fails, hopefully there'll be other approaches to weed management which end up being successful. And this is important because it addresses this goal of making farm systems which are more resilient. Finally, the third principle of the many little hammers approach is that by using diverse tactics of weed management, you create scenarios where you could have synergy. And this is the performance of many tactics together is better than expected by the performance of each single tactic on its own. And so I sought to use the many little hammers approach to design effective first-year Kernza systems. Now, what's Kernza? Well, Kernza is the first available perennial grain to consumers. And this is really exciting because it lets us envision a future where the bread that we eat and the beer that we drink doesn't have to come from crops which are replaced every single year. Okay, another important component of Kernza is that while its seed heads can be fed to humans, its stems have enough nutrient value to be sold on forage or livestock feed markets. Okay, so again, this adds resilience to a farm system. Now, despite all of these benefits, Kernza tends to grow pretty slow during its first establishment year. And this makes it particularly vulnerable to weed competition. So thinking about the many little hammers approach to weed management, I wanted to see whether I could design effective first year or establishment year Kernza systems through the combination of multiple ecological practices. And I basically designed an experiment that had 8 treatments, okay? I had an untreated control, which is you plant Kernza in the fall, it overwinters, it emerges in spring, nothing happens. I had 3 single tactic treatments, which were mechanical treatment that included rotary hoeing and tine weeding, red clover intercrop, and a spring mowing treatment. Now, both the tine weeding and rotary hoeing, as well as the mowing treatment, seek to knock back weeds. Okay, and this is important because it'll exploit size asymmetries between the Kernza and the smaller weeds which emerge later in the season. The red clover is an intercrop, so it's basically a mat that is established and stays throughout the season. So it should smother weeds throughout the Kernza's first year of growth. And then to test the multi-practice approach, I had combinations of each of my treatments. So I had a mechanical treatment in red clover, mechanical treatment in mowing, red clover and mowing, and then a 3-way combination of treatments. And so I replicated this experiment at Mount Pleasant, which is like 3 miles down the road from us, and then the Farm Hub, which is a site in the Hudson Valley. And you'll notice that all of my results are split across sites because of this consistent site level effect that you're going to see. And so the first question is, could we use ecological practices for weed suppression in Kernza? And so compare the control to the 3 single tactic treatments, and you'll notice that there's always going to be at least 1 letter above these bars that is shared with the control. So that means statistically, none of my single tactic treatments worked at suppressing weeds in establishment year Kernza systems. Now, remember, the many little hammers approach says that when you combine treatments, there might be instances where they function synergistically. But when we look at the multi-tactic treatments, again, you'll notice that there was no instance where weeds were statistically lower than the control. In fact, there was actually a treatment that had higher weeds than the untreated control. So not only are my hypotheses not supported regarding my thinking about the many little hammers approach, but also there's some like seemingly nonsensical results where you wouldn't expect an untreated control to have more weeds than a treatment which receives, red clover intercrops and mowing. And so why did this happen, right? I think we can contextualize this result by thinking about the density of fertile Kernza seed heads. You'll notice that at Mount Pleasant, there's no statistical differences between treatments, and that's good. That means that none of my treatments were damaging my crop stands. But at Farm Hub, there was a consistent reduction in the number of fertile Kernza seed heads. And what that indicates is that my weed management treatments, despite my best intent, were damaging Kernza stands, okay? And these damaged stands would create a greater foothold for weeds to grow relative to an untreated control. So this is why we might see a seemingly nonsensical result. Now, considering that none of my treatments effectively suppressed weeds and some of them actually damaged Kernza stands, it shouldn't be a surprise that there was like no case where yields were improved by any of my treatments in this experiment, okay? So like, what does this mean, right? Can we use combinations of weed management tactics for first-year Kernza? No, not in this study at least, right? When we look at the literature, you'll find that there's quite a bit of variability. For instance, Eugene Law, who's an alumni of this department, the Ryan Lamb, and I think he might be on Zoom as well, did a really similar experiment to me where he had an establishment year Kernza and he intercropped red clover. But unlike my study, he found that red clover suppressed weeds. So what does this mean? Well, as a grad student and just generally as someone who's interested in agroecology, it shows me that ecological weed management practices can be quite site-specific, right? It's not like red clover is inherently a failure for Kernza establishment. It's just, it might work better in certain sites. For instance, Eugene's study was done in sites that had only 32% of the weed biomass across treatments in my study. So maybe something like red clover intercropping, maybe it's better suited for scenarios where you're not trying to establish Kernza in a field that's overrun by weeds, which is what I was kind of trying to do. You know, and just broadly speaking, I think that as an agroecologist, it's really important to either understand this site level variability or to design experiments that are explicitly trying to overcome any type of site level bias. And that's exactly what I did when I was thinking about weed communities for my 3rd and 4th chapter. Okay, and so to make this make sense, I just want to go through a theoretical example with you of what a traditional weed community analysis looks like. So, you know, we're all into science here. Let's imagine that we're doing an experiment with treatments A through E, okay? And you might sample weeds here, and you'll notice, there's some differences in species across my treatments. And you might also notice that the relative abundance of these species, again, it differs across treatments. So as a researcher, naturally you would say, is there a treatment effect on weed community structure? Traditionally, you would use a species level approach, and there's plenty of these. This is an example of an ordination. And just like our example, surprise, surprise, there was treatments A through E, okay? And this researcher found that their treatments were having an effect on weed community structure, and that treatment A was most strongly associated to mouse-ear chickweed, whereas treatment E was strongly associated to the increase in the relative biomass of dandelion. That's what TEROF stands for. Now, this is cool, right? There's inherent value in being able to say something like, my treatments affect weed community structure. That's a powerful result. But if you were a researcher or a farmer who's interested in the study and you wanted to apply it in a site that doesn't have dandelion, right? You lose this predictive ability as to how something like whatever the hypothetical treatment E would affect your weed community structure, okay? And so I attempted to overcome site-specific bias or site specificity through a trait-based approach. The way this works is that you do start by sampling weed species and their relative biomass, but instead of just stopping there, you'll quantify a trait or set of traits in the weed community. Okay, so imagine we're looking at life cycle, whether or not weeds are annual or perennial. Then you'll look at the relative proportion of these traits across treatments. And instead of saying something like treatment E was associated to dandelion, you can say something like, there's something about treatment E that creates conditions which will promote the dominance of perennial weeds, right? That's the blue lines. There's some things about treatment B and C that might increase the proportion of annual weeds. And so in this way, you're creating results that are a little bit less specific to your site or your experimental location. All right. Now, remember, the key goal of my PhD was to use ecological thinking to redesign agricultural systems. And conveniently, trait-based data is associated to a rich history of ecological theory. And a really conventional or common example of this is community assembly theory. The idea here is that environmental conditions can function as filters to whatever plant community you observe, and these filters function on traits. Okay, so working with trait level data lets me think within a community assembly framework. And I think this framework is really applicable to agricultural systems because agriculture is many things, but at its core, it's essentially changing environmental conditions, right? And these environmental conditions or practices can be thought of as filters to plant communities. All right, think about something like herbicides. If you were a farmer, you went out to your field and applied a broad spectrum herbicide, you would be filtering out or killing all species that don't have a resistance trait, okay? Right? At the same time, we also know that things like tillage filter weed communities. And there's some more discussion about whether or not things like maybe selecting for a more competitive crop cultivar also filter weed communities. But the important thing is that we know that agricultural practices represent filters, okay? So if I wanted to see how ecological practices can shape weed communities, a much more succinct question that doesn't suffer from site level bias would be, how do ecological practices affect weed community traits? right? And I answered this question or researched it in an organic no-till system. There's some similarities from chapter 1 in that one of my experimental variables is modifying crop density. And remember, from my first chapter, we know that modifying crop density is an effective mechanism of weed suppression. The question here is that when we have a more competitive context, are you also changing the traits within the weed communities that survive this competition and coexist? The second experimental variable was modifying the thickness or biomass of cereal rye mulches. All right, and the idea here is that regardless of the species of cover crop mulch that you use, mulches represent a physical barrier to weed community emergence or to broadly weed emergence. And so when you use thicker mulches, the question is, do thick mulches change the traits within a weed community? Now, I did my classic approach where I sampled my experimental variables, soybean density and mulch biomass, and I also sampled weeds at the species level. But unlike a traditional approach, I then quantified the life cycle, emergence timing, seed weight, height, and specific leaf area of every unique species that I sampled. And I worked with this trait level data. You'll notice that each of these traits has a specific hypothesis as to why it could be filtered by increasing crop density or mulch biomass. Now, for the sake of time, I just want to focus on the life cycle of weeds and the seed weight of the species that I was observing across my treatments. I chose to look at these two traits because I was mainly thinking that they would be filtered by modifying cereal rye mulch biomass. And the idea here is that by having thicker barriers, you're selecting for species that have more emergence resources. So thinking about life cycles, I think that the use of a thick cover crop mulch should be more suppressive to annual weeds, right? Because many perennials can emerge through vegetative structures that have a relatively high amount of stored energy compared to annuals which emerge from seed. Now, really focusing in on annual weeds, I was looking at seed weight, okay? And the idea here is that thick cover crop mulches will tend to filter out small seeded species because we know that seed weight is associated to a plant's ability to emerge through thick mulches or barriers, all right? So just to provide some context, I'm gonna start by looking at the change in total weed biomass and annual weeds. Okay, the x-axis here is the increase in mulch biomass, and then the different colored lines are my 5 soybean seeding rates. The bluer lines are the higher soybean seeding rates, the denser crop stands. You'll notice that we have the most amount of weed suppression as well as suppression of annual weeds in these scenarios where we use both high mulch density and high soybean density, okay? And this supports the many little hammers approach, right? We also found an interaction indicating that there might even be some synergistic effects of combining treatments. Now, my main focus of looking at life cycle, annual or perennial, was thinking about how perennial weeds would be able to survive really thick mulches. And effectively, I found that there was no statistically significant effect of using really thick cover crop mulches on the suppression of perennial weeds. And in this case, soybean density is on the x-axis. And what this graph shows us is a really unexpected result, which was that the amount of perennial weeds was affected by crop density. Okay, and this was both exciting and unexpected. And it shows that you can use crop competition as a mechanism of suppressing perennial weeds. And that's a pretty important result because perennials can oftentimes be the bane of an organic and especially an organic no-till farmer's existence. All right, so my second trait was seed weight. And I looked at seed weight through a slightly different lens in that I was looking at the community weighted mean of seed weight. And community weighted means are essentially weighted averages. In my study, I weighted my averages by the relative abundance of certain species in my field. And looking at changes in community weighted means essentially indicate that an environmental filter is pushing a trait towards a certain functional composition. And so when we look at the change in community weighted mean of seed weight, you'll notice that it increases across my mulch biomass gradient. Okay, and that supports this hypothesis that thick physical barriers will filter out lighter seeded species. So what does this all mean, right? Well, I think there's two important takeaways from this study. The first is kind of this proof of concept, which is that, again, ecological thinking can be used not only to suppress weeds, but also to shape weed communities. Why does this matter? Well, this matters because if a farmer was to come up to me and say, Uri, I've got this perennial weed, how do I best manage it? With this research, I could tell them, maybe you're not going to be as successful investing in a really thick cover crop mulch as you would be thinking about using the most competitive crop you could. Okay, and so, it's not like you're going to get complete suppression of your perennial weeds, but there's more probability that you're going to have success in the system. The second important, I think, finding of this study is that it develops our ideas of the many little hammers approach, because it shows that not only is the combination of ecological weed management practices better at just suppressing weeds, but also that diverse weed management practices can filter different weed functional traits. And this matters because the use of many ecological weed management practices could be more effective at having a more holistic weed suppression and creating systems where you won't end up with one really problematic dominant weed. Okay, mulches suppressed small-seeded annuals, whereas crop competition was more effective at suppressing things like perennials. Now, another way to look at weed communities while overcoming site-level bias is to think about the phylogenetic distance within weed communities. The way this works is that you first start by mapping out the evolutionary relationship between species, and then you look at phylogenetic distance and compare the phylogenetic distance of different treatments. Now you might say, but Uri, I'm still seeing species names in your comparison of treatments. How is this not a species level approach, which is going to be associated to site level variables? And I would just remind you to think about what a phylogenetic tree means, right? Phylogenies show evolutionary relationships. And we know that the position of plant species across a phylogenetic tree will reflect its overall functional identity, right? There is going to be always convergent evolution across plant phylogenies, but overall, phylogenies reflect functional grouping. Now, why does this matter? I mean, imagine that you're working with two thistles, right? A dandelion and a Canada thistle. These two weeds will be more phylogenetically similar and also more functionally similar than a dandelion and a giant foxtail, for instance. And so at the community level, when you see a community that has more phylogenetic distance, that's an indication that that community is also more functionally diverse. Okay, if you see a community that's less phylogenetically distanced, you know that there's perhaps some filtering towards a particular functional identity. And thinking about what we know regarding phylogeny and ecological theory, we know that the phylogenetic grouping of plants is associated with their fitness in different environments. And there's plenty of experiments that show this. This example is from Jonathan Silvertown, where he did an experiment modifying waterlogging conditions and found that a plant's phylogenetic grouping was associated to its success in these different environments. And I mean, that makes sense. Think about whether or not you were to plant a cactus in a marsh, right? Any plant from the cactus family would do a lot worse in that marsh than a plant from the lily family, right? Success in different environments is overall associated to phylogenetic grouping. So thinking about this ecological theory, I wanted to see whether or not the use of cover crops created environments that affected the phylogenetic distance of weed communities. So my assumption here is that cover crops are modifying environments, okay? And I don't think this assumption is too far off, right? Just think about a field of sorghum Sudan grass cover crop and a sun hemp cover crop. These two species are really densely planted. They'll create soil environments at the soil surface that are shaded. But there's also some species level specificity, their effects on the environment. I mean, let's just think about my legume, non-legume example that I've been running with for this presentation. The sorghum Sudan grass is a non-legume cover crop. That means it needs to use up soil nitrogen from the soil. Okay, so as it grows, it should create environments that have relatively less nitrogen than something like a legume cover crop, like sun hemp, right? That sun hemp can fix some of its own nitrogen from the atmosphere. So the environments under these two cash crops should be relatively different. And I would think that a weed that's related to sorghum Sudan grass and might also not be able to fix its own nitrogen should do worst under these environments. And so my hypothesis is that cover crops create conditions that most intensely suppress phylogenetically related weed species. Now, to test this hypothesis, I did a study at two sites in New York State, Musgrave, which is down the road from us, and the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. And the study was composed of two experiments, okay? A winter cover crop experiment and a summer cover crop experiment. And one thing I want you to remember is that winter cover crops are planted in the fall, they're present in the winter, and they've already had time to modify habitat conditions when summer annual weeds are emerging. Whereas summer cover crops are planted in the spring at the same time as the emergence of a lot of summer annual weeds, okay? The way these experiments were designed was that there was one tilled control and 4 cover crop treatments. In the winter cover crop experiment, this was canola, hairy vetch, cereal rye, and a cereal rye hairy vetch mix. In the summer cover crop experiment, I had that tilled control, then the buckwheat, the sun hemp, sorghum Sudan grass, which is the picture you saw, and then a mix of the sorghum Sudan grass sun hemp mix. Because this is a randomized complete block design, all of these treatments are replicated, and this yielded a total of 120 different plots. In each of these plots, I sampled weed communities, okay? So now I've got 120 data frames of species and their relative biomass. I then used, right now, the largest known molecular-based phylogenetic tree of vascular plants to create 120 unique phylogenies, okay? One for each of these communities. I then calculated the phylogenetic spread of each of these trees using a metric called interspecific mean pairwise distance. And this is a really special metric because, to my knowledge, at least right now in 2023, it's the only metric that can be weighted by biomass. So it takes into account the relative proportion of weeds in the field, as well as is independent of the relative richness of my different samples. So if I was to sample a weed community with 5 weeds or 30 weeds, I should get some type of accountability for the fact that a community with 30 unique species is more likely to be phylogenetically spread. Once I had this data, I could answer the question whether or not cover crops affect weed communities. So first, I looked at whether or not cover crops suppressed my weeds, just to provide context. Then I wanted to see whether or not the overall phylogenetic distance in cover crop treatments was different than that under a control. And finally, whether or not the phylogenetic similarity between a cover crop and a weed affected its interactions. Okay, that's like the final boss. So first question, right, to provide some context, do cover crops suppress weeds? Well, you're going to see a graph that has my 2 sites, and then the winter cover crop experiment and the summer cover crop experiment. And I want you to compare the tilled controls to the cover crop plots, so the open circles. And so do cover crops suppress weeds? Unequivocally, yes, right? All of my cover crop treatments reduced weed biomass on average by 58%, but there were 4 cover crop treatments that had up to 99% weed suppression, okay? So if anyone is like cover cropping, it's like a nice idea, but it won't always work, you know, it can work really well. But we already kind of knew that from past experiments, right? Really interesting stuff comes when we look at the phylogenetic spread of cover crops relative to the tilled controls. And so what you're seeing here is interspecific mean pairwise distance. This is a unitless number. The larger the values, the more spread there is phylogenetically within a community. So in the winter cover crops, we know that the tilled control and the canola had the same amount of phylogenetic spread. But my other three cover crop treatments, the cereal rye, hairy vetch, and cereal rye, hairy vetch mix, had less phylogenetic spread. There's less, perhaps, functional diversity within a phylogenetic perspective in these plots, right? The kind of, you can imagine their trees to be less spread than the tilled control and the canola. Now, in the summer cover crops, none of my treatments were different than tilled controls. And this was so interesting because remember, all of my cover crop treatments suppressed weeds, all of them, both in the winter and summer cover crop experiment. But only the cover crops that overwintered or had some more time to modify habitat conditions before the emergence of summer annual weeds had the possibility of modifying phylogenetic distance. Okay, and so, I'm not directly modifying the relative emergence of cover crops compared to weeds, but I have, again, some indication or tie back to the fundamental theory of phylogenetic distance and plant fitness, which is you need to have a modification in environments. Now, final question, okay, of this whole presentation. Does phylogenetic relatedness impact the interactions between cover crops and weeds, okay? The way I calculated this was by looking at the change in phylogenetic distance of a plant community that only included weeds, and then that same plant community including its cover crop. So if there's a value above 0, I know that the cover crop is phylogenetically distinct from the weeds it coexisted with. Okay, and when we look at my results, you'll see that there's, all of the treatments observationally are at or above 0. There's no instance where weeds were more clustered around the cover crop than expected by random chance. And when we focus in on the 3 cover crops that had indications of filtering weed community phylogenies, we can see that they're all either significant or marginally significantly distinct phylogenetically from the weeds that coexisted with them. So what does this mean? Well, this means that when cover crops filter weed communities, they tend to be most suppressive to phylogenetically related species. Okay, and that aligns with my thinking of that original sorghum sudan grass and the non-legume wheat. Okay, and so thinking back to my first phylogenetic result, we think that this is more possible when the cover crops are also established prior to the emergence of weeds. And so what does this study mean? Well, it provides some preliminary indication that, if someone was to say, Udi, I want to manage this one problematic weed with cover crops, what's my best bet? I could tell them, well, 1, select a competitive cover crop, but 2, try to select a species that's phylogenetically related to it. And if you can, try to manage it in a way where it's established prior to the emergence of your problematic weed, right? It's creating these more effective management systems. All right, and really, that's kind of this overall view of my PhD. And so after 4 years worth of experiments, right? I come back to my original question, which is, can we use ecological practices to redesign agriculture? I think we can. In chapter 1, I showed that we can redesign organic no-till systems to be productive and profitable using ecological processes. In chapters 3 and 4, I showed that we can hopefully change the shape or structure of weed communities using ecological thought. But I wasn't always successful, right? I had this study, chapter 2, where nothing seemed to work. I think this just shows that ecological weed management or ecological practices on the whole, they're really knowledge intensive, right? There's no such thing as a silver bullet in agriculture. Just think back to how I started this talk, right? I started thinking about, COVID showed us that food systems are vulnerable. The global supply chains can be easily broken, and that workers in the food system aren't treated equitably. And I don't pretend that ecological crop and weed management will go close to resolving any of these problems. But I do think that hopefully it can make farm systems a little bit more resilient to climate change, and it can make them, maybe a little bit less damaging to the environment. And so I hope that if my PhD or if my work here as a grad student at Cornell means anything to anyone, it's that I hope that we can acknowledge that we can always use our research to hopefully redesign agricultural systems, right? We should never compromise for systems that damage the environment or are socially unjust. So with that, thanks again for being here. A huge thanks to my committee for supporting me academically and intellectually throughout the process. Ryan Lab, you guys are friends and collaborators for life. My other collaborators, I feel honored to work with. Funding, thank you so much. Made everything possible. And then finally, a huge thank you to my family and friends. So thanks.
Do you have time for a couple of questions?
I saw your hand first. Yes, actually, let me turn on the speakers in the room. Okay, hopefully people on Zoom can hear you. Yeah. Yep. So hopefully people on Zoom comment if you couldn't hear the question, and I'll repeat it, but they couldn't hear it? They could or could not hear it. Okay, so for people on Zoom, correct me if I was wrong in interpreting it, I found that the mulch biomass of cover crops in chapter 3 was associated to more weed suppression. But does that actually improve yields? Right, that's a great question. So, what do we know about cover crops? Well, there's some really interesting meta-analyses on cover crops that show that their effect on yields can be quite variable. Like on average in the corn belt for corn and soybean, they'll have marginal reductions in crop yields, but that's typically in conventional systems. Remember that I'm trying to work in systems that don't use herbicides or use less herbicides than tillage. And so my thinking is that in these systems, the weed suppression that you'll get from a cover crop should reduce the overall seed banks. And across time, as you rotate to different crops, you'll hopefully have systems that are less constrained by weeds, and they should be more productive because they'll have less weeds to compete with. So I think the answer is that within a context that's trying to reduce tillage and herbicides, the effects of a cover crop mulch on the whole will have, in the long term, beneficial effects on yields, hopefully. Harold, I saw your hand up. Yeah.
Did you, sorry, I guess in your first chapter, did you see a pretty consistent spatial distribution of weed biomass, or do you think that it's profitable to get up to the higher seeding rate and keep the economic benefits with a more targeted seeding rate?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so for Zoom, I had this study, my first chapter, which was looking at soybean seeding rates, and the question is, can I have a more targeted approach to high seeding rates, where instead of having an entire field seeded at 520,000 soybean seeds per hectare, I could have targeted seeding? I think that's totally possible. That is so interesting. I mean, weeds definitely do grow in patches, especially like perennials that emerge vegetatively and that creep. So theoretically, yeah, totally. And that would make a lot more economic sense. I would love to do that work. Yeah, great question. Thanks for the idea. More questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah, so for Zoom, the questions were about chapter 2 and 4. Okay. Yeah. So how do, if I was to, one, did I replicate my experiment across multiple years? And two, thinking about climate variability across sites, how would that affect my results? That's the question for people on Zoom. So I replicated the phylogenetic experiment, chapter 4, and the trait-based experiment, chapter 3, across both space and time. Chapters 1 and 2 were only replicated across space, but they were done in the same year. So generally speaking, what does that mean? Well, that means that when I don't replicate across time, there's inherently more of that site level specificity, right? Because we know that things like no-till planting soybeans into a cereal rye mulch tend to work a lot better during wet years, okay? Because that cereal rye mulch is consuming soil moisture. 2019, which is when I did my soybean optimization study, was, I think, a relatively wet year, if I remember correctly. At least it wasn't like last summer. But I think that inherently, the more replication you have for these experiments that are working with ecological practices, the more you can try to account for and minimize site level variability. Okay, I think there's, like I said, it's really important to try to acknowledge that site level variability. And the more replication you have, the easier it is to, not be constrained by it. So, yeah, cool. Anyone else? Your opportunity to make me cry. No questions on Zoom? Okay, well, I won't cry. Thanks. You have a question about phylogenies? I am here.
Hi, Peter Woodbury here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Thanks for your great work. I had a question for your phylogeny analysis, whether you have or whether you might, if you haven't, whether you might want to analyze those data by trait, sort of as you're in your previous analysis. Yeah. And then kind of use phylogeny to mop up any residual to see if phylogeny has any predictive power after you already account for traits that you expect to be important.
Yeah, I definitely, so I don't have trait level data can you hear me, by the way? Because I know there's a lot of background noise.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I have not associated trait level data to those weed communities. I chose not to because, well, first of all, I think it would be really valuable to do that. But in this case, for that isolated study, I chose not to, because I think it's really important to have a specific hypothesis as to why and how your ecological suppression mechanisms can affect or filter traits. And that's really easy when you have something like modifying the thickness of a cereal rye mulch, selecting for more emergence resources, or modifying crop density of soybeans to shade out weeds. But it becomes a lot harder, at least for me, to hypothesize how using different species of cover crops, how specifically that'll affect the traits within a community. That's not saying that I have like no thinking of what traits would be affected, but I think that by using phylogenies, I took a much more broad approach. And that's why I avoided looking at traits, because I didn't know which ones out of the infinite range of traits to study, if that makes sense. That was my reasoning. But I do think it's really valuable to combine trait level and phylogenetic approaches. You still there? Good?
Yes, thanks for that. Again, just, I was suggesting combining the two. So pick some traits you think are important and test how much explanation you get from those. And then the remainder can be, you can use phylogeny to see what remaining explanation can be gained.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that those studies are really valuable. I really do. I think that is a good suggestion for sure. Thanks. Okay, well, if everyone, I think there's no one else on Zoom, so I will turn off the mic and thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.